Further debate, I recognize the member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it ironic the amount of times as a new member that we've stood up as part of the official opposition to have this discussion around time allocation. And I also find it ironic that we've had this discussion around time allocation and often heard government members say that their work is transparent. I don't understand how their work is transparent if at every opportunity to travel the bill, a bill that is in fact going to have to address something that people at the doors were talking about, they don't want to go out and speak to the people. So I'm just going to focus my comments today on that, on the importance of taking the time as members of the government to actually speak to the people of Ontario. I think that maybe part of the challenge is that the government in their debates and as they speak in this House about this bill and, to be honest, about other bills before it, the assumption is that people of Ontario only want to speak about what happened under the Liberal government, as though what happened in the past is done. That's it. That's all that Ontarians want to speak about. They do not want to speak about their future. But I would argue that many, many people in my riding of Kitchener Centre want to speak about the future of Ontario. And that means they want to speak to the legislation that's before us in this House. We know that, based on what happened with the healthcare bill, there was a lot of rhetoric and discussion about, well, in the past 15 years, the Liberals did this and that, and now we're talking about what we're going to do, and then all of a sudden they don't want to talk to the people anymore. I think that we have to be really, really honest about what it is that we're doing, or we can't say that this government is acting in a way that's truly transparent. Transparent isn't telling people what you think about the past. It's about telling people about what you think about the future. And I think that part of where Ontarians are concerned is that we have no sense of what the vision is, because what we have seen is we limit debate so that less and less people of Ontario, not us in our bubble, but people in Ontario, the people that we were elected and we were brought here to represent, are no longer able to speak about something that the government says is totally different direction, but in actuality is exactly the same place. Transparency would allow the people in Kitchener Centre to speak to this. Their expertise would be able to be part of the legislation that we have before us. And I think, most importantly, the rebuilding of trust. So I'm going to take a step back. For 15 years, the Liberal government made promises, then they weren't kept. There were some things when we were nearing the election time that were kind of thrown out into the public, and there was some hope that was there that the Liberal government would be able to make some changes and maybe things would be okay, but it was 15 years. So now the people of Ontario are trying to figure out if they can trust their government. How are they supposed to do that if every time one of the major issues that led people to vote in a variety of different ways, I'm in a riding that they've never voted NDP, and here I am. So people want change, but the only way to rebuild the trust with the people is to go and talk to them. Imagine that, talking to the people.
You're a revolutionary.
I am a revolutionary. Wow. I hope that that's captured and answered. And so here we are with another bill that represents literally a major and consistent issue that Ontarians felt it's something that whoever they vote for, we've got to address this, we've got to address this. This was a major issue during the campaign. So then why would we be worried about talking to the people with regards to what direction we want to go in? Or, in the case of this particular bill, whether or not they're willing to just slap a new name on exactly the same approach. I don't think that Ontarians would be happy with that. And knowing that, and knowing that I'm part of this group of humbled leaders who sit in this bubble when the House is sitting to try and help to move Ontario into a better place, I think it's important for us to be honest and go out and talk to them. Let's find out if I'm wrong. I'm okay with being wrong, but we'd have to go and speak to the Ontarians to find that out, right? So it's wonderful that we're sitting here and having this discussion and time allocating yet another important bill, but I guarantee that if a healthcare bill, which was also way high up on the list of issues that Ontarians had during this past election, that they were concerned about, that they raised their voices about, if 15,000, right? 15,000? No, how many people actually tried to speak to committee? Okay. Right? So we've got 15,000 people that said, hey, I want to speak about this. To me, that's a sign of a very healthy democracy. People want to get involved, right? So we're going to double check the actual amount of submissions. And we know that close to 20,000 people wrote in. That one we know. Close to 20,000 people wrote in because that was the only way for them to engage with us. And 1,500, correcting the record, wanted to present.
There you go.
So 1,500 Ontarians said, I want to speak to you. And close to 20,000 Ontarians said, I want to speak to you. I would guess that Ontarians want to speak to us. Just saying that it's very possible that they would like to speak. And so when we now take another major issue and say, we don't really want to speak to you all that much, and people have to see this as what has happened in the past, I think that's the same advice that people give you about relationships. The behavior, not the words, the behavior is a sign of what this relationship is really going to be like. Yeah. And that's why Ontarians are worried. Well, that's why they're worried. So we can talk all the talk, we can slap on bumper stickers, we can spend the Ontarians' money to make sure that the talk is out there. What they want is action. And that means they want to speak to us. They want to rebuild that trust. And in my opinion, we should see this as an opportunity to get to know Ontario now. Not the Ontarians that thought, okay, this is what I think about the Liberal government, but what do the Ontarians right now think of the Conservative government? And I'm sad to say that in Kitchener Centre, with the onslaught of emails that I receive every single time the government makes a decision to just move forward without speaking to people, it's not looking so hot. It's not looking so hot. So let me help you help yourself. Right? Go, speak to the people, see what they say, then make a decision, and make that decision be informed. If regular people say, oh, I think we should go in this direction, and you have real proof and arguments and facts and information to provide otherwise, maybe they'll change their mind. Or maybe, imagine this, they have information and facts that they want to share with us so that we can move Ontario in a brighter direction. Why are we afraid to talk to each other about stuff? That's what time allocation does. It doesn't allow us to speak to each other. And if this is what leadership looks like in 2019, imagine what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next? They're going to look to the people that are willing to talk to them because Ontarians want to speak to us. They want to engage. So I think as much as we talk about transparency, as much as we say that we're listening, I don't feel like we're listening. I don't feel like the government is truly listening. And I feel badly. I feel badly, actually, for my government colleagues who think that this is going to be okay. Because it's not going to be. Because imagine yourself in any scenario where the people in charge don't listen to you, and ask yourself how well that goes. What do you think about when you go home? when you turn on the news, when you sit down and eat with your family? Do you say, you know what, I love my leadership? Or do you go home and you say, you know what, Liberals, Conservatives, they're doing exactly the same thing, so I'm going to go the route of the official opposition. I don't know if Hansard can actually pick up the way I said that, but since it can't, I used a very musical tone to accentuate my excitement of being part of the official opposition, because the reason I'm here is because I listen to people. Because I'm part of a party that wants to hear what Ontario needs and will address those needs by talking to them, by taking them seriously, by recognizing and respecting that they are part of what we do here. They're not the enemy, and that's what it feels like when you shut down debate, when you don't listen to them, when you say, oh, 20,000 people wrote to us, we'll read that in the summer after we pass the bill that's going to impact them about the thing that they just talked to us about. So my job as a member of the official opposition is to help to support the movement of Ontario. And sometimes what that means is I may not agree with a vote that happens in this House, but my job is to be able to go back to Kitchener Centre and speak to my constituents about why things happened. I wish that I could get a why. I've heard many, many people in the government stand up and say what they're going to do. I don't know if there's a real clear understanding of why they would do it without listening to the Ontarians, the people that they say that they're doing this for. Those are the most important people. It's kind of like a classroom. You know who the most important people are in a classroom? The students. Also with a musical tone. The students. They're the ones that you're working for. They're the people that are the focus of this. Well, the whole reason why we're here is because we're supposed to be focused on Ontarians, the people that we're supposed to be working for. And yet, time and time again, something extremely important, something that is going to impact them for a long, long time, we decide, we'll talk to them for, nah, let's not. That's essentially what we're doing. Yeah. We're saying, we'll pretend like we're talking to them because we know better. So I will just wrap up with this. If the goal ultimately is for true transparency, if that is the ultimate goal, then I think it's extremely important that we stop time allocating and actually go and travel bills and let people talk to us about where their concerns are so that we can do better. We have to do better, and we can. And that involves going out across Ontario and actually speaking to people who want to speak to us. Thank you.
Right on.